So after all the writing, all the debating, all the editing, re-editing, drafting of this declaration, the Articles of Confederation, after all of the putting together of those sources and changing things based on different critiques, voices in this time period, all with the Revolutionary War waging on, the articles are finally completed. However, the articles have no legal force in and of themselves. Just because the document was written, just because a Congress of sorts, a meeting of state delegates agreed to it in its final form, all this in a legal sense meant nothing until each of the 13 states accepted it. At that point, it would take on legal power. It would have legal viability. And this process of ratification is important for understanding the movement forward and even understanding how important that was to the Constitution. One of the arguments is that the Constitution should be interpreted as ratified, as the ratifiers, the state conventions, understood what they were ratifying and how they understood the nature of the document to be. Another way of understanding the Constitution. And so the articles were completed, the writing and the drafting, the debating was all completed on November 15, 1777. The articles existed in their final form, but they had to be accepted by the legislative governments of the states, which means they would go to the states would further debate them and then decide in the negative or the affirmative. And if they decided in the negative, then the government described in the articles had no power over them. Similar with the Constitution, later Constitution. Legally, doesn't mean that there wouldn't be external pressures of other kinds. So the articles required unanimous acceptance of all 13 states. And so what this means is that the articles had to be so general to be relevant to all 13 states that if one state didn't accept unanimously, then the Union would not exist. Now, presumably, you could have had a partial confederation of like southern states or southern and middle states or middle and northern states, something of that kind in its place. But the articles stipulated that it was a requirement that all 13 states unanimously accept. Then, and only then, when those components were all in place, could the articles have any legal standing, any legal force in regard to the states. So the government of the articles, while it existed on paper and an idea, would not come into existence in reality until the states finally agreed on it. Now, this took a long time, or long relatively, but when there's a war going on, this is a process where time is kind of the essence. So North Carolina only ratified part of the articles and at first and did not fully ratify until 1778, April of 1778. So this shows you the power of the states. They could say, I accept this, but I reject these other clauses. So it shows you the states are the ones deciding if there would be, whether or not they would enter into any sort of union, team, alliance, league, or confederation. Maryland did not ratify the Articles of Confederation until 1781. And then, of course, remember, 1781 is the year in October where Cornwallis will be defeated at Yorktown. And so the revolution is almost over. Now, they didn't know that necessarily at the time, but the revolution is almost over, and it's at that point that Maryland finally ratifies. Now, remember, the whole point of this document is because the idea is we need this one government, this confederation of the states, in order to win the war. That turned out not to be true. said by Rothbard, the articles were not exactly greeted with great huzzas. Rather, they were greeted quietly and dutifully as a needed part of the war effort against Britain, meaning the articles were not seen as some major accomplishment, and this Confederation was not seen as a major achievement by the states to be celebrated, but rather it was a thing which they basically had to grit their teeth and deal with in order to achieve a larger result. And so you could imagine the feeling of the fact that before the Articles government is able to even do anything, the war is over for all intents and purposes. But this government remains. And a government created, or a Confederation government created under the pressure of wartime and the desperation of the war, would not necessarily be what you'd want after the fact, or a peace after peacetime resumes, a peacetime sort of confederation or government. And later the articles also will become that stepping stone for the precedent of states giving up even more power to the constitutional government. The articles were a major step from the loose but effective government of the Continental Congress to a more centralized government. Now this direction is moving toward what might be called the more nation-state model of governance, where you have a government who has a monopoly on legitimate coercion rather than dispersed power that is self-governing and limited. The articles were an important victory for conservatism and centralization. This was a move forward for them, and the Constitution would be even more so, because despite the quality of the men who would hold office in the first constitutional government, like George Washington, power had been ceded to this entity now known as the U.S. federal government under the Constitution. And the articles started to pave the way for that, to move things in that direction, meaning that the independency of the states would be threatened, and that there would now be an opportunity, instead of a confederation or a team that's voluntary, there would be a central government which would create opportunity for conflict, I should say, and competition between the states, because they recognize that whoever controls the central government may also control the rest of the union. So each of them in sections of the country or divisions will all join in a contest for power for who will control the other side of the union. And instead of controlling the other side of the union by direct force, it will be controlled through gaining the federal government. And then you start to see these opportunities as things move toward an inevitable civil war at that point. The articles began the process that had caused secession from Great Britain, centralizing national power over the sovereignty of the states, meaning the Americans and the principle of the Revolution in thought was that the British had no right to rule them in this way, and that they could rule themselves. But now the idea was that the Americans and the states could not rule themselves, that what was needed is a centralizing force, whether it's a confederation government or later federal government under the Constitution, that will be able to limit the powers of the states. The states can be bad too, but it's spread out and with less scope and less geographical territory. The Articles were truly a stepping stone for the coming Constitution. Now, some people view that as a good thing, some people view it as a bad thing, and some view it as mixed. That now the Articles have kind of set the frame and the context toward the future Union. And the growing assumption of that future Union will not be a voluntary team of states joining and unjoining according to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. That just government derives its just power from the consent of the governed, and that when the people feel that it is time to alter or abolish it, they have the right to do that and institute new government over themselves, not physically, geographically leaving anywhere, but have a right to say we limit the power and authority of this current government, and we now declare that we will rule ourselves within this smaller geographic territory. The right to do that in the Constitution, in the Declaration of Independence, as it was explained, would now become more and more questionable in the Constitution, to the point of eventually becoming unthinkable that the Union would be indivisible, as the Pledge of Allegiance would later state. And that the concept of an indivisible Union means that anything like the Declaration of Independence is a threat to the authority of a modern nation state and may be crushed by force. So what you eventually have is the principle of the Declaration of Independence to separate from and institute new government as the revolution, and you have the Articles and the Constitution as the counter-revolution, the thing that reverses all those things and replaces government abroad, central government abroad, with central government at home, with actually more powers than the British ever had or ever dreamed of. And so this was a major stepping stone toward the government of the Constitution, although the Articles will be abandoned. And there will be a very, in a sense, questionable process of how that is undertaken when they invite men to the Philadelphia Convention in order to discuss the editing of the Articles.